Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We know that this is a hot topic, so it is no surprise to us and to our clients that we would have a high number of attendees, so we certainly appreciate it. But as you saw in the invitation, I can see in front of you, we will be discussing some tips in working with your tenants to increase cash flow and some best practices and lessons learned in this initial, I guess it's now 8 days that rent payments have been outstanding or collected in our first month since the real impact of COVID-19. To kick things off, for those of you that may be a little less familiar with Aprio, as we do have both clients, employees, others in our network, and those beyond that are in networks of other networks. Wanted to just give a quick introduction about who we are. Aprio, and then formerly Habif Irrigating Wind, for those of you that may not have been around us in the last 2.5 years. It has been around for almost 70 years. Headquartered here in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where myself and our panelists reside. We have a staff that makes up almost 600 individuals spanning several states at this point. Offices located in New York, North Carolina, Alabama, and Georgia. Consisting of almost 80 partners and servicing clients all around the globe. Hence our in excess of 25 different languages spoken, and we're well represented around the globe within the Aprio family, as over 25% of our employees are foreign born. Regarding who we serve, that spans a wide variety. It depends on your needs. We're certainly working within our different practice areas, catered specifically to our clientele. We are divided into a series of industry niches, 6 to be exact, so that we can hone in our expertise to best serve you, understand your needs and what you're going through, and be there as your strategic advisor for all business cycles that you may encounter. As I mentioned, within our niche groups, we have a variety of specialty services. We are unique in the CPA industry in that we are more than your traditional CPA firm. We are a CPA-led business advisory firm. Several of our partners are not CPAs. Several of our employees are not CPAs intentionally, and serving very specialty areas running across multiple industries and service lines. With that being said, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our extremely kind panelists who didn't require too much arm twisting to join me here today to discuss some of the items that they have seen over the last 30 or 45 days, and then in particular, as rent is now due, within their respective industries. First, I'd like to take a second to introduce Brian Granith, a partner at OA Development, who will be speaking on behalf of the commercial office space. In addition, also joining us is Tim Bonenberger, property controller at Wood Partners, who will be valuable in sharing some insight, particular to the multifamily industry. I'll allow each of them to give a quick introduction about their companies to help set the tone to what you can expect to hear from their perspectives. Brian, why don't we start with you?
Justin, thank you very much. So OA Development, again, my name is Brian Granith and I'm a partner with OA Development. OA Development specializes in suburban office, kind of a unique niche. Most people you hear want to be in town or in more urban environments, and we have had a long history of specializing in suburban office. So all of our properties are mid-rise, your typical square or rectangular floor plates, highly functional office buildings in the B plus and A category. As far as suburban office. We have property in Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh-Durham, and Cincinnati, Ohio. We currently have about 2.2 million square feet after a number of successful dispositions in 2019. We were, till recently, very active in the acquisitions market, although that is clearly on hold with the change in market the last 4 weeks.
Thanks, Brian. Tim, can you give us a little background for those that may not be familiar with Wood Partners and the perspective you'll bring to the table?
Sure. I'm property controller over the management company arm for Wood Partners, we kind of average around 50 to 55 properties that we manage at any one time. That's a result of Wood Partners being a merchant builder model, which means, we have a construction group. We build a lot of our properties with equity relationships. And then once they're built, more than likely we sell most of those assets at some point or another. Some we hold. And so, our development construction teams have different issues that they're dealing with right now. The issues that I'm seeing mostly from an accounting perspective are from the management company side. But we're definitely seeing, one thing I've experienced in with my company is we're seeing properties that are in all the phases of development, from just coming out of pre-lease. We were just starting to try to lease up a couple assets that just came out of construction right when this all began. We also have assets that have been stabilized and have been around a while and are for the most part leased up completely. And then some that were kind of in between those two phases that were almost done with lease up and not quite stabilized, but almost there. So we've got assets that are struggling through this pandemic that are kind of in every phase of real estate. And we also had some dispositions that were planned. So we're kind of in the middle of all those issues and just dealing with them daily. So hopefully I can share with you guys some best insights, at least from our perspective, on what we're doing. You guys can take away from that.
Sure. Thank you. Not surprising that each of you have mentioned different activities that your businesses are undertaking or would ordinarily be undertaking during this time period that have slowed and or stopped. However, bringing us all here today is one thing that must not stop, which is collecting tenant rent. And so that is a good transition here into the issue at hand. It's something that does require all hands on deck. A lot of strategy involved in this process, and it's going to vary in some respects based on your asset type, perhaps based on your demographic, based on compliance or a need for compliance with fair housing regulations. I know I've spoken with each of you about this, and I think as of 3 days ago, we felt pretty good about where we were. Brian, why don't you lead us off in your response of what you've seen so far in this first week of April?
Sure. So far in April, we've had a fair amount of success collecting rent. We've received about 96% of rent. We actually have one large tenant we're anxious about that still hasn't paid, but they usually pay around the 6th or 7th of the month. So we're hoping to hear from them today, but we have not heard anything to the contrary that they don't intend to pay April's rent. So far we have gotten, and we'll get into this later, but a number of calls about May's rent and inquiries about some relief for May. But as far as April, so far we have collected more rent from more tenants than we anticipated heading into April 1st.
That's fantastic. Tell me a little bit about, you said more than you anticipated. What was your expectation going into this to understand how different actual was versus expectation?
Sure. So we anticipated probably receiving that. Let me take a step back. We anticipated that more tenants would just not pay and wait to be called, or wait a few days into April and say we did not pay because. But what's really happened is they're paying, we think, in good faith, and then the next day reaching out with a letter, a phone call saying, can we talk about May? And we think partially that's because, they pay, generally you would pay April 1st rent with March's revenue. And enough of March was already in play and operating, half of March was operating close to full capacity with income coming in. So they're able to pay April's rent, but it's going forward that they're very anxious or concerned about rent.
Sure. Certainly makes sense. Tim, you're looking at it from a little bit different side of the coin here, looking more at obviously individuals in the multifamily space. How does that compare to what you guys have experienced during this first week?
Yeah, I saw a report this morning. A lot of it is very location driven. I think as a company, we've probably taken like a 10 to 15% hit, but then we have areas where we had a report came out this morning. I think we're hovering around, 50 active properties right now, and we had about 38 of them collect more than 90% of the rents on site, which is really, really good. We've even had, it's like we have small wins in certain areas, and then other areas we're still trying to figure out what's going on with collections. We had a property out in California where some tenants had even graffitied the walls saying, don't pay your rent, just because of things that are going on. And we had over 90% collection at that property. So one thing I was going to speak on in a little bit is just, we specifically at that site have an outstanding site team that had really good relationships with all of the residents. And I think that was, at least right now, we're hoping that that's kind of key to driving collections and weeding out the bad boys who are going to take advantage of the situation. Because I think we thought the same thing that Brian just mentioned, that a lot of people are just going to wait for us to reach out and contact them. But we found for the most part, I think people are, if they can pay, are paying. And we're not necessarily communicating to tenants, hey, we've got payment plans in place. We're waiting to kind of see what happens. And we're kind of in that phase right now after 8 days in, where we're going to start seeing people who haven't paid, starting to reach out to them and starting to figure out what kind of payment plans we're going to do for them. But it's very different property by property, locality by locality, since we're all over the country. But it's pretty shocking. It was to me to see that some of our good successes are out in California. We have a really good success in Chicago. Some areas where some of the restrictions have come down really, really hard. We're doing okay on collections, but tenant base for us is also really important. I mean, we have some sites that are heavily empty nesters, people who are doing okay. Other sites are heavily workforce and maybe hit hard, particularly by a certain industry or something that's, jobs just aren't there. So a lot of it's for the apartment industry is very locale driven, but we found that, the site relationships have been a good resource to combating that and getting payments in, and we'll just kind of see how things go, but we can talk about that in a bit more.
Sure. Well, it's certainly good to hear from both of you that there's still some faith to be given to mankind out there, that they are still making their best effort to do the right thing. Certainly the expectations varied, as Tim, you touched on, and I'm going to cycle back to you, Brian, on what's happening in different localities. And that's been, not only are there different factors that are hitting different parts of the country, and this is coming through in different waves, depending on where you're located, or where your properties are located, rather. But different states and localities have come out and said a variety of different things about rent payments and eviction moratoriums and things like that, which only seem to add something to the complicated situation that we already have on hand about what that expectation would be. Brian, can you touch on a little bit? I know, we discussed that you had some different experiences based on the location of your properties, and it was even different than your expectation as to what you saw so far. Can you touch a little bit about on the geographical location and any impacts you're seeing there as it relates to collection of rent?
Sure. So the more I say this, the more I surprise myself that I'm always surprised by what ends up happening. Whatever I predict, it's always, the reality is always a little different, and I should stop being surprised. So I thought we would have more issues in Atlanta than in Charlotte or Raleigh, because those markets have been so strong. The occupancy has been so stable, and we've been able to push rents and occupancy beyond even our pro forma. in those two markets. And yet the first tenants to reach out and the majority of requests that we've gotten have indeed come from Charlotte. And second is Raleigh, with Atlanta trailing in third. So I've been surprised by the number of tenants there that have asked for rent relief, large, small, growing, stable companies that have, reached out. Maybe they're just being opportunistic. That's what we have to figure out. But I have been surprised geographically that we've had significantly more requests coming from the Raleigh and Charlotte markets than from Atlanta.
Very interesting, and that's a good question that I'm sure many folks are still kind of fine tuning in their own processes and procedures. You guys had both mentioned that in many respects, folks were making their payments, businesses and individuals alike, and then maybe asking to talk about what to do for the upcoming months and that time period, obviously, to be determined. Leading into the April rent being due, I'll start with you on this one, Tim. What communication did you have with your tenants? Was this a wait for them to come to us and we'll just assume we're going to collect in full if we have not heard otherwise? Oh, we lost Tim there. So I'm going to jump back to you, Brian, for a moment.
Okay.
Question. But what conversations have you had, and would you be expecting collection if you've not heard? Did you go ahead and take some proactive measure in getting something out to your tenants, or just wait for them to reach out to you first?
We've been very communicative with our tenants about COVID-19 and some of the issues that is presenting, but not in the sense of offering rent relief. We thought long and hard about it and actually debated it back and forth for a while in the office and said, if we open that window, we crack that door open, the tenants are going to push through it and see an opportunity to ask for rent relief, even if they don't need it, or to come to us first when maybe they have another place they can postpone, certain payments, or expense obligations. So we decided to stay quiet. However, when a tenant requests, we're very sympathetic in our response. Doesn't mean we can do everything they want, but we're very sympathetic in our response. But as far as being proactive, no, we were not proactive on that in that respect. We did not offer anything or want to hint that we were going to, offer some kind of relief if needed.
Sure, certainly makes sense. And hopefully in your communications, they look to defer any type of expenses that was except for rent and fees due to their CPA.
Right, that's right.
That. Obviously, I think as we will look through this, and it sounds like obviously you spent some time coming up with and discussing internally about what that process would look like. When would the communications commence? What would those communications look like? And what would we really need in order to come up with any type of decision about whether or not to provide rent relief to a given tenant? Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like for OA development? If I'm your tenant and I know I need rent relief, what does that look like after I've now made that initial ask?
Sure. So we have a kind of a form letter that we send out that we will tailor to certain tenants, depending on who's asking. So, like, for example, we've had a couple of our medical office tenants. We just have a few medical tenants, but they have now all asked for relief because they're clearly not seeing patients. And so there, it's an easy yes. They know that they'll have the patients will come back. You can't do telemedicine forever. At some point, the dentist has to get inside the mouth, and the orthopedist has to see the knee and the hip and the shoulder and the elbow. So they know their revenue will come back. And all those groups actually have been very professional in the way they requested, really saying, we'll add it to the end of the lease, or we'll pay it back between August and December. We'll just add to each month because they know they're going to be working 6-7 days a week to make up on the backlog of patients. And they've been very communicative, and we're going to work with them. But we have been asking for a number of items, trying to weed out who needs help and who wants help, and those who need it, how much do they really need? Because one of the issues, as word gets out there, that the lenders are going to work with the borrowers, both the banks and now the life companies are starting to show some flexibility. word is out there to the tenants, well, if my landlord may be able to defer a couple of mortgage payments, I can defer my rent payment. The issue with that is the mortgage is about 30 to 35% of the monthly expense. The rent is 100% of the income, right? And the tenant who wants to defer their rent payment still wants the electricity working, right? Lights on, HVAC fully operational, the landscape cut, and more importantly, they want the space being cleaned. You know, we're doing extra cleaning now for COVID. We are disinfecting and cleaning more and more. So they want all of those services to occur. They just want to be able to defer their rent. And we're trying to have to explain to the few tenants who have stepped up and said, well, we understand, we don't know your specific situation at this specific property, but can we delay, you know, you may be deferring mortgage payments, which you won't share with us, so we can defer our rent payments. And we've had to explain that it's not a dollar for dollar. We can't, it doesn't work that way, right? We have to keep the lights on, and Georgia Power expects us to pay our power bill. So it's been, each communication has been different, you know, it's been tailored to the tenant and their needs and where they are in their relationship with us. Well, one other example, we had a large multinational tenant reach out to us for some relief. They're in kind of the restaurant retail sector. And they asked, we're in the middle of lease renewal negotiations, and they're a multi-floor tenant. And so that's different. We know they don't necessarily need the money. They're a huge and multi-billion-dollar a year enterprise. They just see an opportunity here, and we don't fault them for that. So we're making this part of a larger discussion on the renewal side.
Got it. Yeah, certainly makes sense. And applying the due diligence, I think, is one thing we want to make sure we are touching on throughout this as we're looking at not only sharing your experiences, but what we're hearing from our other clients, what's happening out there in the industry, and
Sure.
whether we like it or not. You're completely right there, Brian. Some will be taking this as an opportunity, whether or not there's a need.
Right. That's right.
A process in place to be followed, and being able to adhere to that process and go through that effort is certainly recommended in order to make sure that we're not being taken advantage of as property managers and or owners. Tim, you dropped off there, but you're back here, and we're glad to have you rejoin.
Remote work issues.
Right.
There you go. We're all going through them. It's a matter of time before one of us has an animal or a child run across the back. So we certainly understand it. I imagine our entire audience does as well. We were just talking a little bit about, as you caught some of that conversation, on following up on the concept of, we have not, or at least in the case of OA, and it sounds similar to your situation, tenants haven't reached out yet. They made their payment and then started conversation. Did you guys have any memorandums, any notices that you sent to your tenants, and that may be driven investor to investors? I know you're working with different equity funding there, and maybe there was an ask coming from that perspective. What did you guys do up until April 1 as it relates to communications regarding rent or potential rent relief with your tenants?
Yes, I have let me see, I can share a lot. So I think weeks before the shelter in place and a lot of things started shutting down, Wood Partners did a pretty good job about starting to plan for a what if. And I think a lot of it might have come from just what ifs that we would have to deal with if there was a hurricane in some area or whatever other disaster that might happen. Our kind of approach, because we just have, a lot of different payers with all the 10 multi-properties, is we try to develop, I think, first of all, I think we're month by month. So right now we only have policies and procedures around April only, not May, June, and July. So we're starting with April. And because we have so many renters and we don't know what all their situations are, we started with kind of an in-house internal policy that everybody's following at the site level. And there were a lot of phone calls and a lot of collaborations and a lot of memos that were drafted that the site teams needed to leverage and use for guidance regarding, okay, when rent comes, we had rules around what do we do with late fees? How late do we let people pay? And what are the requirements around that? What do we do about people who want to break their lease? What do we do about app fees and application fees and admin fees related to folks that were kind of in the tenant applicant portal, trying to get a unit? And we developed overall high level policy around those for the site teams to start with. And they really went from an approach of, okay, I've got these tools that I need to use and guidance. And oh, by the way, there, to your point, there might be a couple, Goldman Sachs may say, no, I like your policy, but I want you to do it this way. And another investor may say, I want to do it this way. And they're usually just small little tweaks. One example might be, we're saying we're going to waive late fees till April 20th. And as long as you either pay or have a payment plan in place by April 20th, your late fee will be waived. Whereas an investor might say, you know what, we're waiving all late fees. We don't care the reason, we're just waiving late fees, period. Little nuances like that, I think we're dealing with across the country and with different investors. But we started with internal policy. Let's see what happens. As we start to identify the tenants who haven't been able to pay, we leverage those policies to then reach out and try to figure out what can you pay and what kind of payment plan are we going to put in place. And before the call, I was even comparing that policy to like another investor policy. And there's even other nuances around, we might say, we'll take anything, especially if we want to preserve that tenant relationship. And we know that when this is all over, the cost to go out and get that tenant is pretty expensive. So to keep these tenants that we have who are just struggling at the moment, it's pretty important to just come up with a payment plan that works for them, that identifies we're all in this together to kind of get through it and then come out on the other side. Some investors just want to have their hands in it a little more. So they might say, you know what, we're only going to give you down to 50%. And if you can, if they can't pay 50%, you got to go through our asset manager. So we have a little less control with, okay, how's that communication going to happen with the tenant on how we're going to develop this payment plan and get it in place. And we haven't even talked about how we're going to document all this in our accounting system to make sure as we do this across hundreds of tenants that somebody's tracking it some way. So that's a whole nother issue. But just kind of high level, we're just taking a step-by-step process where we have an internal policy first around all these things. We kind of wait to see what happens. And then we work with tenants, tenant by tenant, where the site teams are becoming crucial in managing those communications. But then on top of that, kind of to supplement making sure these tenants feel like they have solutions around making payments, I've been seeing we have a daily communication that comes out from our marketing and executive team. And it might be something as simple as, we sent a PDF that listed guidance from every single utility provider in the country saying, these are the benefits we're giving you, whether it means, we're not charging late fees for 3 months, we're allowing you to pay late or not pay at all until you're back on your feet. And it's just a big PDF that has by gas vendor, electricity vendor, kind of what they're doing. And we've almost got communications like that across all of our vendors that are serving the tenants. And then we also have memos internally for ourselves on, what we're doing regarding our internal vendors who are taking care of their property, just to help with the expense side of things. And so I feel like there's a lot going on and it's changing daily, but we're trying to do the best we can with daily communications to manage, also telling the tenants, okay, this is how you go out and get support. This is the website you go to get unemployment. This is the website you go to for your state and locality to, figure out how you're going to get relief from this plan that's coming out of Washington. So we're doing the best we can to also recognize that a lot of our tenants are panicking and maybe they don't necessarily know where they can go to find the information to help themselves. So we believe if we help them help themselves, that hopefully in the back end, it'll mean they'll be able to pay their rent and come up with a payment plan and stay in place. And, we haven't even talked about, we're also doing virtual tours. I mean, there's things we got to do about the buildings that just got placed in service and are empty. And we projected, leasing up 15%, 20%, 30% over the next couple of months. And that's just taken a huge hit. So we're also just trying to figure out how to get that out, software and virtual tours and all kinds of things. And all our multifamily vendors are figuring that out too. They're coming, I feel like daily I get emails about new ideas on how to implement those things and push them out across the country. So that was a lot, but it's just, there's a lot going on every day.
Yeah, so I want to tap into a couple of those, and that's kind of good preface for the second half of this conversation. There are some items, and Brian, this probably isn't as much in your space. Tim, I think you said maybe you have some fair housing maybe that you deal with, but not on a wide scale. But Brian, you mentioned a comment where we're really seeing it impacting federally insured loans and mortgages for our multifamily clients, in which, through the CARES Act and even prior to the CARES Act, Fannie and Freddie came out and said, hey, look, we're going to go ahead and send letters to all of our borrowers and say, if you can prove that you've got a financial hardship essentially as a result of COVID-19, submit some documents, and we'll put you on an up to, I think at that time was 90-day suspension of debt. And when that's so widely publicized as it's been, what does that mean as it relates to the tenants, and how do they feel that they have an obligation, and who really has the upper hand in that conversation anymore? So it's certainly an interesting situation for those that are out there in the multifamily space, or certainly even in the single family space, that are working with federally insured loans and some potential other challenges that you may see. One of the other aspects you were talking about, and I heard from each of you about deferment of rent a little bit, as far as some options you guys are considering at least in your internal policies, and maybe even started some of those conversations with your tenants. Once you understand a little bit, I expect a slightly different answer from each of you, being that Tim, being in multifamily, you're working off of short-term leases, right? These are generally speaking, we're talking about a year. So depending on where they are in that cycle, a deferred payment may or may not be a viable option for some of your tenants without other modifications to your lease agreement. Whereas Brian, you've got some that are spanning, 5, 10, 15 years, just depending on the life cycle of when they may have signed. So it's an interesting compare and contrast. Brian, let me start with kind of what you're seeing on how you're handling the deferred payment, and what other options you guys may be offering or considered offering to your tenants.
So we're looking at a variety of options, both in terms of a partial rent relief, as well as a deferment of rent that will then be made up over a period of time with additional rent payments, or adding to the tenant's lease term, depending on what we think may be most helpful to the tenant and possibly most advantageous to us.
Sure. Yeah, I saw, I think one of the big ones that we saw that IWG, I guess formerly Regis, went and it was a few weeks ago, and went to all of their UK landlords and simply offered and said, we are proposing a deferral of 3 months, and we will extend all of our lease agreements by 3 months on the back end to make up for it. Certainly something we're seeing that seems to be very common, probably the most common tactic that we're seeing in the commercial office and retail space. How's that apply for you there, Tim, since you aren't working on long-term leases? Are you guys considering the extension option, or what tactics have you guys both considered and then plan to implement?
Yeah, no, today we haven't, there's nothing around extending leases. It's only whether or not we'll let someone break a lease. Today, our policy is, people can break a lease as long as they can pay at least that current month's rent, and they'll be out of that unit by the end of whatever month that is that they decide to break their lease. So we also haven't agreed to do, we're not implementing any concessions today either. It's really just a matter of, let's take the tenants that we currently have and work with them on payment plans. I haven't yet seen what some of the numbers look like as far as what we're allowing people to pay. I just know that we're trying to be as flexible as possible with payment plans, but I do know we're not changing any current lease agreements, and we're not giving any necessarily concessions that are COVID-19 related per se. We're just trying to work with tenants in their current lease and working out payment plans to try to see what we can do around that stuff.
Sure. Yeah, a couple of options that we've certainly seen out there. I would say they are undoubtedly less common. For sure, the deferral of payments is the number one. But a couple certainly that applies equally, I think, to various asset types that are certainly worthy of consideration. One being the application of a security deposit, or a partial application of a security deposit. That's cash. We're sitting on hand. It's sitting in a restricted escrow account. We're holding it till the end of the lease period to address damages, and secondly, once damages are cleared, the next thing we're turning to is were there any delinquent balances, and that's where it's going to get applied. So in a situation that we have here, to free up some operating cash flow for our owners and our managers, while also providing a form of relief to our tenants. One of our kind of helpful hints and suggestions there is give some thought to the application of some of your security deposit funds that you've got on hand. There are a variety of others to consider. We will certainly be seeing more options and tips as folks are seeing what works and what doesn't. As each of you had mentioned, we didn't have to do a lot of that yet, but certainly we'll continue to be getting more creative over the coming months. Before we joined live, I guess, on this webinar, with everybody being remote, it being one impact, but certainly another opportunity here. Brian, you had mentioned, we still got to send somebody down to the office because they got to pick up some checks. Certainly the first of the week. That's not only does it help with the safety of employees while also benefiting your tenants, but for those of us that are not out there accepting credit card payments for rent, now's a pretty good time. We certainly look like we're going to be in this quarantine phase for at least the rest of April, given that at least here in Atlanta and in Georgia, schools are closed for all of May as well. So it certainly seems like May is quite possible. And who knows, with rent being due in the beginning of June, if that extends past June the 10th, that's another month of rent that we're looking to deal with. So if you're not, we usually are operating on a no cash policy and not to get away from that. That's good. It's good controls and what auditors such as myself like to see, no doubt about it. But start looking at credit card payment options as well, that may give you an opportunity to get your collection at a higher rate or even in full, in this particular point in time.
And one comment I can share to that, Justin, just on credit card payments, I've seen where, I think we're waiving, fees related to credit card payments and things like that, just for tenants who maybe that was the one reason why they didn't do it. That's just a small thing I know we've done internally is whenever they got to the payment portal, that we're no longer charging that fee, I don't believe.
Yeah, I think along the lines of a fee, that fits right in with other incentives that we can give. Incentives are still valuable leverage for existing tenants, not just to obtain a new tenant. And so if it's waiving a fee, if it is offering a discount for an on-time payment, or things like that, Tim, I recall you mentioning that that's something that you guys are considering deploying as well. So there's a lot of different options out there. We certainly won't share all the trade secrets here, but we will be happy to discuss that with any of you that are in attendance. Please reach out to me after this webinar and be happy to talk about opportunities for your properties. We also will share a link to our COVID-19 Aprio Advisor Hub, where we share different cash flow ideas, other webinars, fresh content, as certainly with everything, there is a continual release of new information. And us all being in this together and working through this together as an industry is a time to come together. So it's super important. I think I heard a little bit there as you guys were talking about understanding a tenant's ability to pay. And we know what their current maybe financial situation is, and they may or may not have any ability to influence the success or profitability of their business, depending on the industry that they may be in. And this is probably a particular question, Brian, for you, is what resources are you making available to them? Are you giving them suggestions on where to go to obtain? I think you mentioned looking for other funding first before coming to us for relief. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like and how you're guiding your tenants.
So we are offering them avenues to go to or we're not offering advice, so to speak, but we're offering or recommending avenues to go for the SBA loans, the PPP, payment protection program, and making sure that they're taking advantage of everything that the government is offering, so that we're not just the first place they're going to. We want to make sure that all aspects of their business are as healthy as they can be, and that they're taking advantage of everything out there. Because obviously at some of the mom and pop shops, good tenants, great people, who came to us first, and who may not have the sophistication as some of the national tenants who send you the letter by FedEx versus the mom and pop tenant who sends you a very down to earth, sweet email, asking for help, or the first few that reach out to say, what's your policy? Well, that's a fishing question. Versus, here's how we've been impacted, here's what we need. Even if they're being slightly aggressive, knowing we'll try to reach a compromise with them. So, but the tenants, again, that have reached out with, well, what's your policy? Well, our policy is that you go to these other avenues first, but if there's a true need, come back to us and we will attempt to work with you. Never promising in writing, but always being responsive and trying to be thorough in our response.
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned there, the SBA loans is certainly something I think all of us have likely heard about at this point. Is a fantastic resources for your tenants. I know,
Right.
Brian, we've had quite a few conversations over the last few weeks about how to encourage your tenants to seek some options using these existing SBA-backed programs, particularly even that the payroll protection plan offers not only an opportunity to keep your workforce high, but up to 25% of those funds can be used for rent.
Right.
So it's a
That's right.
fantastic solution for your tenants, which is a great option to understand where we are as an audience. Coming back here a little bit, we've been talking about what we're doing with folks that, at least at this point, are paying. Touched on a little bit about maybe what's going to happen with late fees or payment plans. What if someone simply isn't able to pay now or going forward? How do you plan to look at that from an eviction perspective? Start with you, Brian.
So we're going to take a good look at the tenant history. How long have they been a tenant? Have they always been current on their rent? Is it truly, because we understand the industry that they're in and how COVID can impact them immediately? And if we can, we'll work with them. One of the things we have to keep in mind, and you, I think, mentioned this at the outset of the webinar, is tenant acquisition is so expensive and timely that it is to our benefit to work with the tenant and give them a couple of months or 3 months or even 4 months of rent relief and add it to the end of the lease, or have them pay it back over time. Because again, to just remove the tenant is not an easy thing to do. First of all, the eviction process, and again, second, if it's a company we have faith in and we have faith in the leadership and they've always been a good tenant, we know they'll come back and do the right thing when this is over and this is behind us as a nation and a world, then we know it's much cheaper to just offer them rent relief than it is to acquire a new tenant.
Sure. While this may or may not necessarily align directly with evictions, but I think it certainly aligns with those that may be seeking something other than rent relief as we think of it. Have you at this point either experienced any of your tenants looking to invoke the force majeure clause within their agreements? And if not, what is your thought about the clause and its applicability within your business?
So I'm not a lawyer and I don't pretend to be, although I do have a fairly significant understanding of the leases and the documents. But we've had one tenant, again, it was a very good tenant, but a more of a mom and pop company who tried to invoke force majeure in an email to us and then did not apply the definition correctly. It was, they tried to kind of bend the definition to fit how they thought it might apply to benefit them. Again, it is the tenant we will work with, not under force majeure, but only one tenant so far has actually tried to use the words force majeure on us or invoke that clause in the lease.
That's good. We are certainly hopeful that that's what we'll see across the industry. Undoubtedly, there will be, I'm sure, a wave of tenants that will be making that attempt.
Yes.
For those that are out there, we certainly encourage when that comes up, obviously certainly seek counsel. Should certainly be
Yes.
our first move. Understand what the language is within your specific lease agreements. That may be different site to site or tenant to tenant. Certainly we all try to operate within a generally standard lease agreement, but understanding what's in your documents and what rights you have as the landlord, as the management agent, will certainly guide you a little bit in your path to working with your tenants an effective solution.
Right.
Certainly hopeful on behalf of really everybody involved, but certainly for the owners and the management agents, that the realization that force majeure will cost significantly more to litigate than it would to simply just make the rent payments.
Right.
And hopefully that'll decentivize folks from pursuing that path. But nonetheless, there's always a few bad apples, and this situation will be no different. So we expect that to come about at some point in time, and hopefully the courts will set a precedent, set it favorably for the landlord and the owners and the management agents. But I think in time we'll see the results of that. Tim, the question there may be a little bit different for you. You know, you talked a little bit about breaking leases and allowing them to happen if they pay. What is your stance? And this may very, I expect that your answer may very well change depending on having any federally insured debt within your properties, as there's a requirement to hold to do an eviction moratorium. I think it's now up to 120 days for tenants in those sites who can show financial hardship as a result of COVID-19. So when the decision is in your hands, what are you guys doing about evictions for failure to pay?
Yeah, so I was just speaking with our vice president before this call on the concept of evictions and what we're going to do, because, you know, I think our general idea around tenants who are just choosing not to pay, even if they can, or tenants who, you know, can't. I think what we're choosing to do is, I think a lot of it is back to, we're real big on just making sure the site teams have good relationships with as many tenants as they can. And through those relationships, a lot of it is a little financial education and trying to tell folks that if you can pay your rent, something, even if it's not everything, but you're just choosing to go with the guy who splashes graffiti on the wall and says, don't pay rent, that there could be impacts on you financially and your credit. I mean, your best option is to talk to the site team, figure out what's best for you in your current situation. If that means you can only pay a very small amount, I think they're willing to allow you to do that as long as you have decent payment history up to this whole pandemic happening. We probably have some tenants who were kind of already past being good tenants before this all started, and they might be a separate situation where they're just going to hunker down and hold out until, you know, these eviction laws are lifted, and then we'll probably just move forward with whatever we were going to do. I mean, internally, if we have a tenant who is exhibiting behaviors where they should be evicted, they're not paying anything, they don't even want to talk about a payment plan, we're internally actually doing all the same paperwork we would normally do for that eviction. We're even submitting it, I think, to our same folks that we use to perform evictions. They're just holding that paperwork because there's nothing we can do right now in certain areas where you're not allowed to evict. And so, you know, my advice is, at least from our company, is we're doing everything as normal as we can if we have tenants who are not willing to work with us, and just getting ready for that day when things are lifted to kind of move forward and get them out of the unit. But one thing we haven't talked about, just that's kind of baked into this, that we try to be very careful about, is, you know, ratings and reviews are huge in the multifamily industry. And so we're always trying to weigh, okay, you've got tenants who, the ones who have the bad experiences scream the loudest, but we're always trying to fight ratings and reviews and making sure it's very visible that we're working with our tenants, which is why the relationships are so important. So that even if a bad review comes out or graffiti is put on a wall, you still see really good payments coming in, because most of the tenants know that we're doing the right thing and we're trying to be the best we can as a manager to give them a good experience. And especially now when we've shut down all the amenities, they're all paying. A lot of our sites, I mean, our rents are driven heavily by the amount of amenities that we provide. And we're not giving necessarily any relief related to taking away amenities. And so, again, it's just very relationship driven with a lot of these tenants, working with them to come up with a payment plan, but then just making sure if we do have true eviction related scenarios, that we're continuing to do the same steps we always did before, and just stopping at that legal step of actually submitting it and trying to get it processed. At least that's what I'm hearing on the executive calls that I'm on, and how we're managing those situations.
Sure. Yeah, I think you bring up a good point that that we certainly appreciate in our perspective, speaking from the Aprio side, is this is an opportunity to show your true character that is as an individual, that is with your colleagues, your friends, your families, your clients, your vendors, and everybody you're in communication with. We are all vulnerable at this particular point in time, and seeing how we work with one another will have an impact on who does business with whom in the long run. WeWork is out there right now and seems to be just constantly taking a beating and seems to be making poor decision after poor decision. First you had the IPO issue go down. It was about 2 weeks ago when they came out and were holding firm on no rent relief for any of their tenants. And then it was, I think, just last week when their $2 billion fell through, all of a sudden they wanted some help on paying their debt service. So, as you mentioned that from a relationship and a PR perspective, give some consideration to what you're doing and understanding how that's working. Doesn't mean that you're going to always be treated the same way in return, but it is significant, and that will, making good faith effort to understand and be empathetic to everyone's situation will help you both on the collections and on your ability to have some leverage in working with your lenders or other vendors that you have. I'm going to knock off a couple questions here in the Q&A real fast on things we just touched on, and then I want to kind of bring us into maybe a conclusion as we're just about at 2 o'clock. The couple of items I'm going to address here is there was a comment made about a 10K grant under the EIDL to grant, not a loan. I would caveat that. If you're applying for the PPP, that is a grant and it will reduce your forgivable amount under the PPP. So it's not as simple as we once thought it was as things continue to change. That 10K is an up to 10K as well, which it would appear to be based on a number of employees with a maximum of 10,000. So if you, it is not as you once heard it. I guess it was 12 or so days ago when all of that $10,000 came available under the CARES Act. If you've got questions about that and would like to explore either of the SBA loan programs, including the PPP, which I mentioned is forgivable, please reach out. Other questions that came up, Brian, this is from one of your team members. There's more of a comment. Shelter in place until May 13th here in Georgia. So as we talk about what happens with upcoming rents, it looks like May we will be running into that same situation. And that goes back to the safety matter and potentially some credit card payments as well. Last quick item of note was, I believe the comment regarding the clause within the lease is related to the force majeure clause, which in a sense could basically, if there's an unforeseen act of God that may otherwise prevent you from being able to fulfill a contract, may make that contract null and void and kind of give an opening to part ways without any penalties. Again, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I will defer to counsel to walk you through that situation, but something to be aware of, and in a very abbreviated version, that's essentially what's happening there. Last question for Brian and Tim here. For our audience, what recommendations, and I'll start, Tim, with you, what recommendations do you have that our audience should be considering in this process of dealing specifically with the collection of tenant rent?
Okay, so I'll try to not belabor the question. I feel like I could say a lot, but I think for me being in charge of the accounting department for the management company, we haven't mentioned it a lot, but I would definitely say getting a handle on the accounting. We've been having a lot of meetings on, okay, once people start having these discussions about what they're going to do, trying to leverage and automate as much as possible all these payment plans that we're talking about and the deferrals that we're talking about. I was just on a webinar this morning with our accounting provider, which is Yardi, talking about some new functionality that they're going to roll out soon regarding how we can document the payment plan, simultaneously sign that plan, and then also get those charges and everything uploaded into the system so everything is cohesive and automatically done. So I would I think looking into the accounting aspect sooner rather than later would be a good idea. Because, for us having properties all over the country, I don't know what all different agreements people are coming across. And I think having strong accounting behind what's going on will help us really stay on top of it and get ahead of it. I think another thing, as I was thinking through, that would be just really, really important is just, I keep talking about the relationships in the site teams. We internally are also, we haven't talked about it, but we're also, at least on the multifamily side, trying to think of ways to keep morale and appreciation up for our employees. The site teams that are the ones on the front lines managing the tenants, and just trying to make sure that they feel fully supported by the executive teams and the accounting team and all the other groups that aren't touching them, because we're working remote too. I don't know what all the other multifamily companies are doing, but right now most of our leasing offices are closed. We do have maintenance folks who probably come in every day, and we might have folks showing up to the office once to see if payments have been dropped off. But we're managing a lot of these relationships virtually. And so just trying to keep, and these are people, people-driven people who are used to talking to people live. And so we're just trying to make sure that they're supported the way they need to be supported, so that they can execute the things that I've said regarding talking to the tenants and staying on top of things. And it's even more vital on our lease up deals, where you've got like a building that's mostly empty, and we're trying to do virtual leases with these folks to try to get the building, up and running. So I think the accounting system is a big deal. I think making sure that the site teams in multifamily feel supported so they can execute whatever plans management is coming up with regarding what we've been talking about. And then just, we haven't mentioned it either, but just the cost side and vendor relationships is another big one. Just making sure we're staying on top of our vendor relationships, and knowing that, if there's certain vendors that we cut off during this time, that we're talking to them about why, and trying to figure out, well, where do we do that? Where don't we do that? And unfortunately, it's a case-by-case situation. And that's why internally, at least at Wood, we're leveraging each individual regional team to kind of figure out what these decisions are. So I'm pretty sure all of our teams are staying on the phone a lot all day long, trying to figure out what these issues are live across the country, and what they need to manage.
Sure. Thank you. Same to you, Brian. Any feedback or suggestions you'd have for a closing takeaway for our audience?
So it's very similar. It's really trying to be organized and manage, all the communication flowing in every direction. And we're trying to not automate, but come up with a structure and a process for dealing with all the tenants. But as I mentioned earlier, every situation is different. So even when we put together a couple of form letters, you find that they may apply for these tenants, but not for these. And you've got to alter them before you send them out, because it doesn't help to ask, a multinational company for their financials necessarily. It's more about the relationship. And we're trying to stay organized, work through our property management folks, who are the frontline folks. Our team has been absolutely tremendous and working tirelessly, because their jobs are still, full time, and we've allowed them to work from home, but they're finding it may be easier to work from the office. So we're making sure there's social distancing, that they alternate days, so that we're not, there's not too many people in the office. We're trying to adhere to all the shelter in place orders. But again, rent collection is very important, and the mailbox, fortunately, is still filling up this time of the month. So we've got to make sure to grab the checks and deposit them. But to your question, it's really a matter of staying organized, keeping everything documented, communicating with the tenants, and then, as Tim mentioned, with our vendors, we're making sure so far that we can pay everybody. And if we may use the same vendor at multiple properties, but it's a property by property scenario. So 4 properties could be doing fine, and if one has a major hit, we're going to need to sit down with a few of the vendors. I do find it interesting, and I don't say this as a knock, but you've heard many municipalities, mayors, city council members who have wanted to, encourage, renters, if they need, whether it's in the apartment industry or, office renters, don't pay your rent if you need the cash flow, and it's better to use for employees. But none of those municipalities have offered property tax relief, right? So we're finding that quite ironic that some of these city council members or mayors, or I won't mention specifics or which markets I'm referring to, but have been really outspoken about it. And we've actually called some of them up and said, well, you're not talking about property tax relief, and that's our biggest expense. That could be $2 a foot in a building, and the next biggest expense is utilities at $1.20, $1.25. So you're suggesting we don't have the revenue, but are you going to be there for us in November when the property tax are due? Well, no, we're not considering that yet. So again, but going back again to your question, it's really a matter of communication and documentation and staying organized, because there's a lot of traffic, a flow of information right now. And with everybody being separate and working from home, we're setting up spreadsheets and other working documents that we can all, log in and see, so that we're all on the same page.
Cover the questions. If you've got some additional questions, would like to get some more information on anything that we've touched on here, whether that has to do with the SBA loans that were mentioned, questions about the presentation, want to know more about Apreo's real estate practice or other tips that we have for you, please visit us at www.apreo.com/tenant-cashflow. And with that, I really appreciate everybody hanging around. I know it's 10 minutes late. I hope this was informative. I hope you found some takeaways to bring back and implement into your respective businesses. If you have other questions, comments, concerns, or feedback, please reach out. My contact information is listed here. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, Tim. We appreciate you sharing your insight willingly. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and take care. Thanks again for joining.